The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus summoned the crowd again and said to them, "Hear me, all of you, and understand. Nothing that enters one from outside can defile that person, but the things that come out from within are what defile." When he got home away from the crowd, his disciples questioned him about the parable. He said to them, "Are even you likewise without understanding? Do you not realize that everything that goes into a person from outside cannot defile, since it enters not the heart, but the stomach, and passes out into the latrine?" Thus he declared all foods clean. But what comes out of the man, that is what defiles him. From within the man, from his heart, come evil thoughts, unchastity, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, licentiousness, envy, blasphemy, arrogance, folly. All these evils come from within, and they defile. The Gospel of the Lord. Okay. So the last couple of days, we've been reading through these first chapters of the book of Genesis, and I would like to speak a little bit about the genre of these first chapters of Genesis. How many of you have taken like a formal class on the Old Testament or a formal study on the Old Testament? All right, so many of you. All right. One of the common things you hear if you take an official scripture class at an institution or through an extended Bible study on the Old Testament, one of the first things you'll hear about is how the book of Genesis can't be taken literally, right? And obviously that's totally fine for us as Catholics. We don't have to take the beginning chapters of Genesis completely literally. That hasn't been the tradition of the church. Go back to people like Origen and others. They talk about the beginning of Genesis being not necessary to take literally. However, in our modern age, I think it's important to understand as well that in Scripture scholarship over the last 3 centuries, there's been a huge skepticism about the Scriptures. We know we're living in a modern age, and we know that many people in our day are skeptical of God, of religion, of Christianity, and that also has crept into Scripture scholarship. So there's a lot of common things you'll hear about the Bible, which I would question and challenge. For example, one of the things when you read the book of Genesis, what some people will say is they'll say, well, the first 11 chapters, not until you get to Abraham. It's only then that this book really is recounting a version of history. Before that, it's more like myth and allegory. But some people will say, I would push back against that pretty heavily for a few reasons. One, because how can we just say that the author of Genesis all of a sudden changed his mind about what he was writing, right in the middle of the book? Also, we know that Jesus himself spoke of people from those first chapters of Genesis. He spoke of Abel, for example, in his ministry. So are we to say that Jesus was just speaking about a myth? It seems to me like Jesus thought Abel was a real historical person. A tradition of the church has said that Adam and Eve were real historical people. Now, we might not be able to say when exactly they existed. However, we must believe that there are 2 original parents in the beginning of creation. So we should be hesitant about some of those ways of approaching the Bible. Another thing that you'll hear in modern scholarship is that, well, even though the book of Genesis claims to be written by... Actually, do you guys know who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. Very good. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament, which we call the Pentateuch. Again, in modern scholarship, there's a huge trend to totally disregard that theory. And in fact, they go at that with pretty much every book of the Bible. If you take a class on the New Testament at a seminary or a school of theology, the first question you'll always be asked when you start studying a book is, well, did Mark actually write this gospel, or did St. Paul actually write this letter of Thessalonians or Corinthians? It's the first question that's always brought up. And in our modern age, many of us students, we just kind of take that for granted. Well, I guess that's the case. Maybe St. Paul didn't write all these letters. Maybe Mark didn't write his gospel, etc., etc. It's important to understand where that comes from. Again, it comes from a skepticism amongst modern people and modern scholars to question everything. And it also comes from a certain amount of arrogance. Many modern scholars think that we in our advanced age, we in our age of reason, we are questioning things that have never been questioned before, and therefore we are going to be skeptics. And many of them, in their arrogance, don't realize that actually the church fathers and theologians throughout history have asked those same questions and have given very strong arguments for why we can trust the authorship of all these different books. It's the same way with the book of Genesis. You may have heard of something called the documentary hypothesis. That's this idea that the Old Testament is really doesn't have one single author, especially the Pentateuch. Rather, there were 4 different authors. Right? There was the original author, which wrote chapter 2, which we heard from today. And then there was an author later on who wrote chapter 1. And then throughout the rest of the Pentateuch, you see other themes that come up, and so that must have been a different author as well. And anytime you see a different theme come up in the Pentateuch, that's a 4th author. That's how modern scholars try to tear apart some things from the Old Testament. It's important to recognize that this theory, even though it is widespread in theological institutions, it is merely a theory. There is literally no evidence whatsoever for this theory. And yet, if you try to get a degree in theology today, if you try to go get a doctorate, you will not receive a degree if you don't claim to hold this view of the Bible. It's pretty crazy. So, an example of this, some of you, if you've taken even just a simple study of the book of Genesis, you've probably been told or heard that the book of Genesis in chapter 1 and chapter 2 contradicts itself. There are 2 different accounts of creation. How many of you have heard of this? Right? Very common theory, and it's almost like a platitude in today's scripture studies. Well, see, we can't take Genesis literally. We can't give any credence to these accounts because, after all, it contradicts itself right there in the first 2 chapters. And modern scholars will say, well, that's because it was written by 2 different people. Is it actually the case that these first 2 chapters of Genesis actually contradict each other? What people will say is they'll say, well, we have the account of the heavens and the earth, and we have the 6 and 7 days of creation in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, we have another account of creation. And man was created, and then plants of vegetation, and then the garden. Well, which is it? Was it the heavens and the earth that were created first, and the skies and the waters and the land, and then finally mankind, as it says in chapter 1? Or was actually man created first, like it says in chapter 2? And people will point out this contradiction. Is there actually a contradiction? No. And there are many modern scholars who are actually rejecting all of those theories and arguing for why. Part of the reason why people say this is because, again, like many things in the Bible, we're reading it in a different language, and we're reading it in translation. To a Jewish person who is fluent in Hebrew, these first 2 chapters of Genesis don't at all seem contradictory. Yes, in chapter 1, the book of Genesis, it talks about the land and the vegetation being created. And then in chapter 2, in English, we read about similar things happening, plants being created after the creation of man. Well, how is that not contradictory? It's not contradictory because there are actually 2 different Hebrew words being used in each chapter. Same way when it talks about the animals being created in both chapters. Essentially, what's happening in chapter 1 is we're receiving a grand picture of the cosmos. The heavens and the earth, the skies, the waters, the land, from a grand perspective. Chapter 2 is narrowing in. It's narrowing in to not just mankind, but one specific person, Adam and his bride who were created. We're not hearing about vegetation of the whole world. Rather, we're hearing about the plants in the Garden of Eden. We're not hearing about the cosmic animals all throughout creation. We're hearing about domestic animals created specifically for mankind to be with them and serve them in the garden. What we're seeing is not so much two contradictory accounts, but rather an account of creation at a grand perspective and then a narrowing in to the story of Adam and Eve specifically in their garden. If you're ever interested about this, you can look into it a little bit more. There's a great Catholic scholar, his name is Brant Pitre, gives great talks about this. But really, he's stealing it all from a Jewish scholar from the 1950s, a man named Umberto Cassuto, who basically spent his whole career arguing against the documentary hypothesis and especially arguing for the authority of Genesis and why we shouldn't try to pull it apart like so many modern scholars are doing.